Hi, my name's James from Binary Plus Training, and this is your First Aid Kit, your weekly look into the world of first aid, how it can affect you, your family, and everyone else you come into contact with. This week, episode 5, we're looking at the insurance requirements for first aid in the workplace. So this week, we're looking at the insurance requirements for first aid in the workplace. Now, we're commonly asked whether employers require separate first aid insurance cover, or whether it will be covered by their pre-existing insurance. Will they be sued if they practice first aid incorrectly? Do they require separate insurance for performing first aid on someone? Well, before we continue, let me just say that no one in the United Kingdom has ever been sued for administering life-saving first aid. Is there still a risk? Well, there is a small risk, but as long as your insurance policy in your workplace is present, then you should be completely covered. So if you're a trained first aider in first aid at work or emergency first aid at work, and you practice first aid in your workplace, you should be covered by your workplace's insurance policy. It's worth checking with your employer just to make sure. If you are the employer, then it's worth you double checking on your policy itself. This is only in the workplace itself that you are protected by this insurance. So if you're performing first aid out in the street outside of working hours, then your workplace-based insurance will not cover you for that. It's very, very unlikely that anybody would ever try and sue you, and like I say, it's never been successful in the UK for administering life-saving first aid. But there are some provisions where having insurance is really beneficial. So check with your employer that you are covered by either your employer's or your public liability insurance, just to make sure that that cover is present. From an employer's perspective, we have had a few people recently contact us to say that their insurance documentation is specifying what level of first aid training the people acting as first aiders in that business need to have. It seems to only have started emerging in the last 12 months or so to our awareness. It may have been in existence before then. But if you are an employer, please go, after you've finished listening to this podcast, obviously listen to the rest of this first, but go and check your insurance documentation. Go and read through your cover notes, your schedule of insurance, and just find out whether your insurer is specifying what level of training your first aiders need to have. It may be that your risk assessment has only shown that you need 2 people with emergency first aid at work, for example, but if your insurance stipulates that you have people who are qualified at first aid at work level, not emergency first aid at work level, then you're going to need to get their training updated and to make sure that it is compliant with what your insurer is requiring. Otherwise, you know what insurance companies are like. They will do anything they can to get out of paying out when the time comes for that to be done. Remember, you're only going to ever be liable if your actions that you carry, personally liable, this is what's going to fall outside of your insurance, if the actions that you take directly cause injury to the casualty, making them worse off as a result. So if you go beyond the scope of your training and you do something wrong, then you are liable for doing so. If you comply with everything that was in your training, which means that your actions are not negligent, so if you've been on a first aid at work course and you follow what you were taught on your first aid at work course, and it turns out that the casualty then is worse off as a result, you are not liable for that. You are only liable if your actions are negligent and they make the casualty worse off. So please make sure that you do perform skills only within the scope of what you have been taught to make sure that your insurance cover will continue to protect you. And do remember that You might be panicking. Lots of people panic about the thought of using an AED on somebody. Do remember that built into the AED is the way that they detect the heart rhythm, and an AED or a defibrillator will not shock somebody unless they actually need the shock to be delivered. So you do not run the risk of using an AED and making a casualty worse off, making them worse than what they were. So that's a really important thing to consider as well. I'll refer you back to the fact that no one in the UK has ever been sued for administering life-saving first aid. So even if you haven't got any training and somebody is unconscious, not breathing, and you administer CPR, you put a defib on them, it delivers a shock, none of that falls under the realm of negligence and making somebody worse off. So please make sure that you don't panic and think, I'm going to get sued if I do bystander first aid on somebody. It is worth remembering you're under no obligation legally to do so, but by the time somebody's needing life-saving first aid, then there is always something you can do. And if you don't feel like actually intervening and physically performing CPR because you've never been taught how to do it, you don't know what you're doing, always make sure that you're ready to alert the emergency services by phoning 999 or 112 if you're somewhere in the EU. Make the area as safe as you can, monitor the casualty, and give them as much comfort and reassurance as you can. So that's your brief overview of how insurance and first aid work together. If you need any more information on it, don't hesitate to get in contact with us. We will do our best to provide you with as much information as we can. Stick around, because coming up next is this week's top tips. So this week in our top tips, we're going to be discussing seizures. Now, seizures, people can be rightly quite scared by. They appear quite a scary thing if you've never seen anybody having a seizure before. There's not a lot you can do if somebody's having a seizure, but we're just going to go through the basic principles of what it is when somebody has a seizure and how we can possibly help them. So the first thing to remember is that not all seizures are caused by epilepsy. There are many, many different reasons why somebody may be having a seizure. And the primary thing we need to do is make sure that that person is safe. So we're going to move any obstacles from around the person who's having the seizure to make sure that they don't bang themselves into anything. If we can fold up a jumper, something like that, and just pop it under the person's head. Please don't put your hands under the person's head, because if they're banging their head on the floor, for example, then they may damage your fingers and your hands if you do so. But keep the person as safe as you can, moving things out the way and making sure that they are as comfortable as they can be when they come round after their seizure. Now, not every seizure requires an ambulance, but a lot will. Let's go through the times when you would need to ring an ambulance. So if you don't know this person is epileptic and you think this might be their first seizure, or you don't know whether they've ever had a seizure before, or you're in any doubt, ring 999 and get an emergency ambulance on the way. It's really important because, like I say, not all seizures are caused by epilepsy. It could be something completely different that's caused this person to have a seizure, and let's get them the help that we can. Secondly, if their seizure follows a different pattern to what it would normally follow, so you're working with somebody who's epileptic, their seizures have a specific pattern, and they go into a seizure that doesn't follow their normal pattern, then we're going to need to get some emergency assistance. And thirdly, if a seizure lasts for 5 minutes or more, then we're going to need to get an emergency ambulance en route, because they may need some medication to bring them out of their seizure. Most important thing you can do as a first aider, though, is that aftercare, that TLC, after they have had their seizure. So making sure that comfort is offered, dignity is maintained, may need help recovering up where clothes have moved, they may have urinated, something like that. They might need that little bit extra support. So offering that extra support after they've had a seizure can be very important. Do be aware some people coming out of a seizure might be slightly aggressive. Don't hold it against them. It's their brain's way of coming back round again, can express itself as mild aggression sometimes, so just be aware of that. But take your lead from your patients. They will guide you in what they need. They're probably going to be very, very tired. Most people who have a general seizure at work need to go home that day because most people need to sleep it off. So there you go. There's your top tips for this week on how to manage a seizure. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Your First Aid Kit. Hope you found it useful and enjoyable listening to what we had to talk about this week. Make sure you are listening on Thursday next week, or at least have your podcast app pointed ready to auto-download your episode as it comes out next Thursday. Next week, we're going to be looking into first aid and your reputation, and how making sure that you have the right cover, the right equipment, and all the right expertise in your workplace can do wonders for the reputation of your business. Thanks again for joining us. Make sure you hit subscribe on whatever app it is that you use to obtain your podcast so that you can be kept as up to date as possible. And I will see you all next week.